Welcome to Lifespan, the weekly podcast that digs up the dirt on the most outrageous, chaotic, and downright WTF lives ever lived. All told in a fun and fascinating way. Share, rate, and follow the show for more wild stories. Today, we're embarking on, a truly bizarre journey into the life of a figure whose name is synonymous with some of the darkest corners of human experience, Donation Alphonse Francois, better known, of course, as the Marquis de Sade.
That's him, a name that definitely carries weight.
You sent us a really fascinating collection of material outlining his, frankly, unbelievable existence, his scandalous behavior, and the writings that just shocked the world.
Yeah, the testimonies are quite something.
So our mission today is to unpack this dossier you've provided, pull out the most unbelievable, the most thought-provoking parts of his story for everyone listening.
Sounds good.
Forget what you learned in school. This is definitely a history's unhinged side. We have testimonies covering everything from his early expulsion from the royal household for hitting a prince.
At age 5, no less.
Right. All the way to decades spent locked up for sex crimes and blasphemy. We'll also dig into the whole societal context of 18th century France that kind of shaped him, but also was challenged by him, by his whole libertine philosophy.
Absolutely. You can't understand Sade without understanding his time.
So prepare yourself for a bizarre journey into a life that really redefines controversial, still fascinates, still disturbs, centuries later. Okay, let's unpack this, starting right at the beginning. It seems, based on your material, the Marquis de Sade was causing trouble practically from day one.
That seems to be the case, yes. The testimonies you sent us, they mention that anecdote from when he was really young, maybe 5 years old, apparently kicked out of the royal household.
For assaulting a prince, right, a playmate.
Exactly. A playmate assigned to him. Now, it's a small detail, maybe, but it does hint at something, doesn't it? A kind of rebelliousness, a defiance of authority, even then.
Makes you wonder what was going on there.
Yeah, what kind of environment breeds that sort of thing so early on, even on a, kid-sized scale?
Yeah. Definitely not your average 5-year-old. Then, okay, fast forward, he's an officer in the 7 Years' War. After that, he gets married, René Pélagie de Montreuil. You'd think marriage, maybe that settles a guy down. But your sources paint a, let's say, different picture.
Yeah, the testimonies were pretty clear. His marriage in 1763, it did basically nothing to curb what they call his libertine pursuits.
Yeah.
Actually, it seems like that's when the really outrageous stuff starts kicking off.
And what did libertine even mean back then? Your material suggests it wasn't just like cheating on his wife.
No, it was more than that. It's tied into a broader philosophical idea, a rejection of certain norms.
Case in point, the Testard affair, just 4 months after the wedding. This involved a prostitute in Jeanne Testard. And the allegations are, well, they're pretty wild. What stands out in the testimonies about that one?
What's really striking looking at your material is how specific her account is. She claimed he locked her up, started questioning her religious beliefs, but it went further. Allegations of proposing sodomy, flagellation, and then these really shocking blasphemous acts involving religious artifacts, apparently.
Like what? The testimonies mention specifics?
Yes. Allegedly masturbating into a church chalice, stomping on an ivory crucifix. All while shouting blasphemies, supposedly.
Whoa. Okay, so it wasn't just sexual acts then. It was like a deliberate attack on religion itself.
That's how it reads, doesn't it? A clear challenge to the sacred symbols, to the church's authority. It seems baked into the transgression itself.
I mean, yeah, that's a lot. It's not just deviancy. It's, like you said, challenging religious authority head-on, as your sources point out. And this actually landed him in prison briefly, right? Chateau de Vincennes.
That's right. Even being a nobleman didn't give him a complete free pass.
So then we get the Rose Keller affair in 1768. This one, based on the testimonies you sent, sounds even darker.
The accounts regarding Rose Keller. She was a beggar he hired. They paint a grim picture, as you say. She claimed she was locked up, threatened, beaten with canes.
Okay, that's bad enough.
But her accusations went further. She alleged Sade made incisions on her body, poured hot wax into them. Now, it's important to say the dossier notes that hard evidence for those more extreme claims was reportedly lacking.
Still, it raises questions about reliability, maybe exaggeration.
It does. You have to consider the source, the context. But even the core claims were serious.
Serious enough to get him locked up again, this time in the fortress of Pierre-en-Seize. It really feels like each incident is escalating, doesn't it? At least the accusations are.
It seems that way. And then we get to Marseilles, 1772. This time, he gets his servant, Latour, involved in procuring prostitutes. leads to what the sources call sexual excesses.
Including sodomy with Latour himself, right?
Yes. But the really bizarre twist here, according to your material, is the candy. Allegedly giving the women aniseed candies laced with Spanish fly.
Spanish fly, seriously, like out of some old myth.
Apparently so. The claim was it made the women violently ill. They thought they'd been poisoned. What does that suggest about his mindset, you know?
It's just weirdly elaborate, almost cruel in a detached way. So they flee, get caught in Sardinia, condemned to death in absentia. They even burn him in effigy.
A symbolic execution, yes.
Right.
Pretty dramatic, as your sources say.
Hugely dramatic. So he escapes again, retreats to his chateau, Lacoste. And this is where his wife comes back into the picture in a strange way.
Right. The testimonies here get even more complicated. They suggest his wife, Renée Pélagie, might have actually become, well, complicit, an accomplice in his activities.
His wife? Seriously, what does that tell us about their relationship? Or maybe the pressures on noble women back then?
It's a fascinating question, isn't it? But then the scandals apparently continue at Lacoste. Abduction, sexual abuse allegations involving young boys and girls. It seems the behavior didn't stop. Maybe it even got worse, based on these accounts.
The pattern just keeps going. Escalating transgression.
It seems so. Then he flees again, this time to Italy.
Yeah.
And he takes his sister-in-law with him, the Canoness de Launay. She becomes his mistress.
His wife's sister. Good grief.
Yeah. And even that ends dramatically. A reported suicide attempt after she leaves him. He goes back to Lacoste. And, well, rinse and repeat. More scandalous behavior until the final arrest in 1777.
Was there a self-destructive element here, maybe?
You have to wonder, don't you? Just pushing boundaries until they snapped back hard.
And this final arrest was different, wasn't it? The lettre de cachet.
Yes, essentially a royal warrant. No charges, no trial needed. Straight to prison. Your sources really highlight how this shows the absolute power of the monarchy then. It hits an eye hard.
And it was his mother-in-law pulling strings behind the scenes, too, right?
That's often suggested, yes. She certainly had motive and influence. He was thrown into the dungeon of Vincennes first. Sounds pretty grim, according to the testimonies.
How so?
Well, they describe harsh conditions, constant arguments with the jailer, with other prisoners. He even apparently tried to stir up a revolt at one point.
Never one to go quietly, then.
Definitely not. Then, in 1784, he's moved to the Bastille, the infamous Bastille.
Ah, okay. The big one.
And here's where it gets really interesting, literarily speaking. Inside the Bastille, that's where he wrote one of his most notorious, most extreme works, The 120 Days of Sodom.
Written in the Bastille. Wow. What does it say that such darkness could come out of a place like that? Confinement? Oppression?
It's a stark contrast, isn't it? The ultimate transgressive book from the ultimate symbol of oppression. The irony, as you say, is thick.
And then just before the Bastille falls in 89, during the Revolution, they move him again.
Right, to the Charenton Asylum. Apparently because he was shouting out the window, claiming they were massacring prisoners inside the Bastille. Trying to incite the mob, perhaps.
A dramatic exit, fittingly enough.
You could say that. He's actually released from Charenton in 1790, right as the revolution is kicking into high gear.
And you'd think, okay, this guy's going to get swept up, maybe guillotined. But no.
Surprisingly, no. He actually gets involved. As your sources detail, he lives in Paris with a widow, Madame Carnet. He even holds a minor official position for a bit, gives patriotic speeches.
Oh, revolutionary. The Marquis de Sade. That seems unlikely.
It is bizarre. He even narrowly dodges the guillotine himself during the Reign of Terror. It just shows how fluid and strange that whole period was. Unexpected alliances, shifting fortunes.
I thought that phase didn't last long, did it?
No. By 1801, Napoleon's in charge. And Napoleon did not appreciate Sade's novels, Justine and Juliet. So back under arrest he goes, based on the dossier.
Specifically because of the books this time?
Seems so. The scandalous content was just too much, even post-revolution. He spends the rest of his life back in the Charenton Asylum. Dies there in 1814. Even the revolution couldn't quite stomach him in the end.
But even in the asylum, he kept busy writing, staging plays.
Yes, with the other inmates, apparently. It seems that creative drive, however, unconventional, never really left him, as your sources confirm.
Okay. That's quite a life, a whirlwind tour through the scandals based on the testimonies. But to really get him, we need that context, like you said. 18th century France, what was it like? Your material outlined some key aspects.
Absolutely crucial. The testimonies point to a few things. First, the aristocracy Sade's class. Huge privilege, luxury, a really rigid social ladder. But interestingly, also a growing sense of individualism within that elite group. people starting to question things.
So tradition-bound, but with cracks appearing, especially among the nobles.
Sort of, yeah. Lineage still mattered hugely, but personal desires, personal philosophies were bubbling up.
How did that play out in behavior?
Well, that ties into the rise of libertinism, which your sources mention as a significant movement. And again, libertinism wasn't just about sex. Philosophically, it was about shaking off religious constraints, prioritizing pleasure, using reason over dogma.
Okay.
Sade's life can be seen as taking that libertine philosophy to its absolute, most extreme, and often, yet disturbing conclusions. He wasn't just dabbling, he dove headfirst into its darkest potential.
He definitely took pursuit of pleasure somewhere new. And this is all happening during the Enlightenment, right?
Yeah.
The age of reason, questioning authority, that's in your material too.
Exactly. The Enlightenment provided the intellectual backdrop for his radical ideas. His atheism, his rejection of religious authority, these fit with a broader Enlightenment questioning of traditional power structures.
But he twisted it somehow.
Well, he used that emphasis on reason not just to critique, but to seemingly justify dismantling all norms, morality, compassion, you name it. If it constrained desire, it was suspect in his view.
And politically, you had the king with absolute power, those lestres de cachet we talked about, which his mother-in-law supposedly used against him, but also this simmering discontent leading up to the revolution, the one he briefly joined.
Right. It was a real pressure cooker. Add to that the huge influence of the Catholic Church. Blasphemy wasn't just rude, it was a serious crime. Sade's constant attacks on religion, his atheism that was playing with fire, your material really stresses how central the church was.
So, strict religious codes, but also this libertine counterculture bubbling underneath. Must have been tense.
Very. And you had strong sexual taboos, legally and socially. Things like sodomy were heavily restricted. Sade's very explicit exploration of these things in life and writing was deeply shocking, as the dossier makes clear.
Plus, censorship was common, right? They tried to suppress radical stuff.
Oh, absolutely. Radical ideas, scandalous books, the authorities tried to shut them down. So Sade's works were often banned, had to circulate secretly underground, which of course only added to his mystique, his notoriety, made them seem even more forbidden and alluring, as your sources explain.
So 18th century France. Rigid hierarchy, but stirring individualism. Strong church, but rising libertinism. Absolute monarchy, but revolutionary rumblings. Censorship, but forbidden texts circulating. What a backdrop for a guy like Sade.
It's the perfect storm in a way.
Okay, so that's the stage. Now let's turn to the Marquis' pen. The writings themselves, the stuff that really cemented his shocking legacy, according to your dossier.
Yeah, despite being locked up so much, the testimonies confirm he was incredibly prolific. Novels, plays, stories, dialogues, political stuff, often written in confinement.
And he mixed philosophy with, well, the graphic stuff.
Consistently, that's what's fascinating. He weaves these philosophical arguments right into incredibly explicit scenes of sex, violence, blasphemy, really pushing the envelope of what literature could even be. It wasn't just shock value, there was an intellectual project there.
And the most notorious example has to be The 120 Days of Sodom. I mean, just the title.
Right. It signals extreme transgression from the get-go, and the content delivers on that promise, unfortunately. Written in '85 in the Bastille, it describes this horrific 4-month orgy set up by 4 wealthy libertines.
Horrific how? What does the dossier say?
It details escalating depravity that's almost hard to describe. Sexual perversion, torture, murder, incest, bestiality, coprophilia, feces obsession, necrophilia, cannibalism. It's a catalog of the extreme.
Good Lord.
It's considered one of the most transgressive books ever written. But what's key isn't just the graphic shock. It's how he uses this extreme scenario to explore what happens when humans have absolute power and no constraints. It forces really uncomfortable questions about morality.
And written in tiny script on a hidden scroll in his cell. It just adds to the legend, doesn't it, as your material notes?
It really does. Highlights how dangerous the content was perceived to be, the lengths he went to. Then you've got the sister novels, Justine and Juliet. What did the sources say about those?
Right, Justine. Or The Misfortunes of Virtue from 1791, and Juliet or Vice Amply Rewarded from 98. They sound like opposites.
They are, deliberately so. Justine follows a virtuous woman who suffers endlessly at the hands of libertines. Her virtue brings only pain. Juliet, her sister, embraces vice completely and becomes powerful and prosperous.
So virtue is punished, vice rewarded.
That's the explicit message. Through them, Sade explores sexual violence, moral relativism, and launches this scathing critique of society's hypocrisy. He's using these narratives, these characters, as philosophical tools to hammer home his libertine viewpoint, challenging basic ideas of good and evil. Again, there's a disturbing philosophy behind the disturbing stories, as your dossier clearly shows.
It's not just random violence, then. There's a point he's trying to make, however unsettling. Your sources also mention philosophy in the bedroom. What's that one about?
Yes. Published in 1795, that one's structured more like a dialogue, explicitly laying out his extreme libertine philosophy. Discussions on atheism, total rejection of traditional morality, the pursuit of pleasure as the only valid goal, free from any rules.
He just lays it all out.
Pretty much. Your material notes how explicit he is about the philosophical framework here. It's less narrative, more manifesto.
And it includes that political bit too, right? Telling the French they need to ditch religion to be truly Republican.
Exactly. Yet another effort, Frenchmen, if you would become Republicans. It directly links his libertine ideas to his political vision. He saw religion as fundamentally oppressive, hindering both personal and societal freedom.
So it all connects for him: sexual freedom, philosophical freedom, political freedom.
In his twisted way, yes. Across all his work, the testimonies point to these recurring themes: sexual violence, pain, torture, rejecting God and religion, pushing atheism, demanding absolute individual freedom, critiquing society, exploring power dynamics, the dark side of human nature.
And apparently some progressive views on homosexuality for the time. That's in the dossier too.
Remarkably so, yes. Amidst all the darkness, that stands out as quite forward-thinking for the 18th century. But overall, profoundly transgressive stuff, attacking society's foundations.
Okay, so how do we even begin to interpret all this? What was driving him? Let's try to unpack the mind of Sade based on the interpretations in your sources.
Right, this is where it gets really debated, as your material probably shows. The most obvious legacy is the word sadism, isn't it? Coined by Krafft-Ebing.
Based on his name, yeah. Linking pleasure to inflicting pain.
So one interpretation is straightforward. His books are just reflections of his own sexual compulsions. He needed to inflict pain, and he wrote about it.
That's the common take, I guess.
Yep.
But are there other views? Did your sources offer counter-arguments?
Well, some argue, as the sources might indicate, that his actual documented behavior, while bad, maybe it doesn't perfectly map onto clinical sadism as we define it now. Perhaps it wasn't just personal compulsion.
So what else could it be?
Maybe he was exploring the psychology of pleasure more broadly, including the disturbing fact that some people can derive pleasure from suffering others, or even their own. Less about him personally, more a dark exploration of human possibility.
Or maybe it was more philosophical. The testimonies mention seeing his work as a radical critique of morality, religion, law.
Exactly. That view sees him as a philosopher, albeit a shocking one, advocating for absolute individual freedom, satisfying desires without any limits, rejecting God, rejecting religious morality, arguing for a purely naturalistic world, libertinism as a whole worldview, not just hedonism, challenging Western thought at its roots, as your dossier suggests.
So was he just a depraved guy writing his fantasies, a social critic using shock tactics, a philosopher pushing boundaries, or some mix? What balance did the sources strike?
It's likely a messy mix, and scholars still argue about the proportions, as your material probably reflects. Some lean toward social commentary exposing aristocratic hypocrisy. Others lean toward personal indulgence justifying his own behavior. The truth is probably tangled up in all of those.
It's interesting the surrealists in the 20th century kind of adopted him, right, as a rebel figure.
Yes, they saw him as representing radical individualism, rebellion against bourgeois norms. It shows how his work kept resonating with those challenging the status quo centuries later. That embrace tells you something about the enduring shock value, the power of his transgression.
He definitely forces you to look at the shadows, doesn't he? In people, in society.
Absolutely. A very unsettling exploration of our capacity for bad.
Which brings us to his lasting shadow, his legacy. Despite the bans and the outrage, his influence on literature seems pretty profound based on your sources.
Huge. Considered a precursor to surrealism, like we said. He broke ground for tackling taboo subjects head-on, ignored or banned for ages, but then reevaluated in the 20th century for his literary significance.
In philosophy, too, you mentioned Nietzsche, Freud.
Yeah, his ideas about power, morality, the psyche, they seem to prefigure some of their work. He also resonated with existentialists thinking about freedom, absurdity, responsibility. The material you have makes specific links.
It hinted at those connections. And then the most direct legacy, psychology, the word sadism.
Can't escape that one. Even though his writings are fiction, they were early, albeit disturbing, explorations of sexual perversions. They contributed, in a way, to how we started trying to understand these complex things, as your dossier confirms.
And popular culture, he pops up everywhere, doesn't he?
He does. References in art, film you mentioned, Salo, Marseilles, quills, modern media too. His name is just shorthand for transgression, breaking taboos, extreme sex. Often simplified, sensationalized, sure, but it shows this enduring fascination. What examples did your sources give?
They mention those films mainly. He is definitely lodged in our cultural brain, even if it's a warped version. Now, the testimonies also had some specific anecdotes, glimpses into just how bizarre his day-to-day existence could be. Any that really jumped out at you?
Oh yeah, these details are fascinating. The attempted revolt in Vincennes, just pure defiance.
Right.
Writing 120 days in the Bastille, maybe hiding the scroll in a dildo. That's an image you don't forget.
Definitely not.
His transfer from the Bastille, shouting about massacres, such drama, staging plays in Charenton with the inmates. Creativity and confinement again. It paints a picture, doesn't it?
Of someone restless, unconventional, maybe slightly unhinged, even when locked down. We also hear about constant fights with jailers, other prisoners.
Yeah, never easy, apparently.
The way his relationship with his wife changed, Napoleon personally hating his books enough to rearrest him, and that weird belief he had about secret number codes in prison life, it's all very peculiar. Did the sources elaborate on the wife's transformation or the quarrels?
They hint at them, adding layers to the strangeness. And then his quotes, "There is no God, nature sufficeth unto herself." Pretty clear. Or, "The only way to a woman's heart is along the path of torment." Much darker.
Yeah, that one's grim.
And the stuff in philosophy in the bedroom God. God has lost reason. Modesty is outdated. Just deliberately provocative. Do you see contradictions there?
Maybe. Or just different facets of a very extreme worldview. Definitely not your typical 18th century novel. And beyond the big scandals, there's some amazing trivia in your sources, too. Lesser known bits that are just weird. Any favorites?
Oh, some of these are great. His second son dropping the donation from his name. Can you blame him?
Probably not.
Convincing his wife to name their daughter Lori after an old flame.
Okay.
Being engaged to two women at once, his name being a mistake on the baptismal certificate. It's almost like a dark comedy.
And a cast of his skull might be in a Paris museum. He was a magistrate for a while. That's ironic.
Hilarious, isn't it?
His family claiming descent from Petrarch's Laura, narrowly escaping the guillotine because of a typo. Elected to the National Convention during the Revolution. It's just one bizarre twist after another.
Totally. And the story of how the 120 Days manuscript survived, hidden, lost, found years later. Like a thriller plot. His descendants trying to clean up his image in the 20th century. There's even a perfume named after him.
A perfume?
Apparently. And that anecdote about the researcher finding his own family name in Sade's old tax records in Lacoste. Pure coincidence, but wonderfully strange. It all just adds to this long, peculiar shadow he casts.
It's all these little bizarre details that really make him feel like a real, albeit deeply strange person, not just a historical monster.
Exactly. They ground the outrageousness in a kind of odd reality.
So, wrapping up our bizarre journey into the life of the Marquis de Sade, based on this fascinating material you shared, it really shows a man who just relentlessly pushed every boundary of his time. Actions, words, everything.
Yeah, from the scandals in prisons to those shocking books, his whole life was about outrage and, somehow, fascination.
We've seen how he crashed against the society, politics, and philosophy of 18th century France, pushing libertinism to its edge, questioning morality, authority, everything, and the fact that sadism comes from his name. That alone tells you the impact, however disturbing.
A profound and troubling impact on how we think about psychology, pleasure, and pain.
And look, his actions are unsettling, his writings can be really hard to read, deeply disturbing, but his legacy in literature, philosophy, pop culture, it's still here. It forces us to confront uncomfortable things about human nature, freedom, society's rules. So what do you make of a life spent exploring the darkest corners of desire? What does the fact we're still talking about him say about us, about our own fascination with the forbidden?
It's a big question.
It is. This is just scratching the surface, really. We encourage everyone listening to check out the resources mentioned if you want to delve deeper into this truly unhinged life. And maybe consider this. Does our continued interest in Sade just reflect a morbid curiosity about transgression? Or does it point to something deeper, maybe an uncomfortable but necessary exploration of the limits, the terrifying limits, perhaps of human freedom and morality? Definitely something to chew on.